Hello, this is Mr. Harvey with Chapter 20 of Mark Twain's The Prince and the Pauper, The Prince and the Hermit. Remember that Prince Edward is with Tom Canty, with John Canty, the father. And since John Canty has killed a priest in the city of London, he has taken his family out into the country to rejoin a band of outlaws and criminals that he has hung out with in the past. And the prince escaped them and ran into those nice peasant girls. Then he had that scary night in the barn all by himself with what turned out to be a cow. And then he approached a place that looked safe. The prince struck straight through the forest, hoping to pierce a road presently. But he was disappointed in this. He traveled on and on, but the further he went, the denser the wood became, apparently. The gloom began to thicken by, and the king realized that night was coming on. It made him shudder to think of spending it in such an uncanny place, so he tried to hurry faster. But he only made the less speed, for he kept tripping over roots and tangling himself in vines and briars. And how glad he was when at last he caught the glimmer of a light. He approached it warily, stopping often to look about him and listen. It came from an unglazed window opening in a little hut. He heard a voice now, and felt a disposition to run and hide. But he changed his mind at once, for this voice was praying, evidently. He glided to the one window of the hut, raised himself on tiptoe, and stole a glance within. The room was small. Its floor was the natural earth, beaten hard by use. In a corner was a bed of rushes and a ragged blanket or two. Near it was a pail, a cup, basin, and 2 or 3 pots and pans. There was a short bench and a 3-legged stool. On the hearth, the remains of a fire were smoldering. Before a shrine, which was lighted by a single candle, knelt an aged man. And on an old wooden box at his side lay an open book and a human skull. The man was of large, bony frame. His hair and whiskers were very long and snowy white. He was clothed in a robe of sheepskin which reached from his neck to his heels. A holy hermit, the king said to himself. Now am I indeed fortunate. The hermit rose from his knees. The king knocked, and a deep voice responded. Enter, but leave sin behind, for the ground whereon thou shalt stand is holy. The king entered and paused. The hermit turned a pair of gleaming, unrestful eyes upon him and said, Who art thou? I am the king, came the answer with placid simplicity. Welcome, king, cried the hermit with enthusiasm, then bustling about with feverish activity and constantly saying, Welcome, welcome. He arranged his bench, seated the king on it by the hearth, threw some sticks on the fire, and finally fell to pacing the floor with a nervous stride. Welcome. Many have sought sanctuary here, but they were not worthy and were turned away. But a king who casts his crown away and despises the vain splendors of his office and clothes his body in rags to devote his life to holiness and the mortification of the flesh, he is worthy. He is welcome. Here shall he abide all his days till death come. The king hastened to interrupt and explain, but the hermit paid no attention to him, did not even hear him, apparently, but went right on with his talk, with a raised voice and a growing energy. And thou shalt be at peace here, thou shalt pray here, thou shalt study the book, thou shalt meditate upon the follies and delusions of the world, upon the sublimities of the world to come. Thou shalt feed upon crusts and herbs, and scourge thy body with whips daily to the purification of thy soul. Thou shalt wear a hair shirt next to thy skin. Thou shalt drink water only, and thou shalt be at peace, yes, wholly at peace. For whoso comes to seek thee shall go his way again baffled. He shall not find thee, he shall not molest thee. The old man, still pacing back and forth, ceased to speak aloud and began to mutter. The king seized this opportunity to state his case, and he did it with an eloquence inspired by uneasiness and apprehension. But the hermit, still muttering, approached the king and said impressively, "I will tell you a secret." He bent down to impart it, but checked himself and assumed a listening attitude. After a moment or two, he went on tiptoe to the window opening, put his head out and peered around in the gloaming, then came tiptoeing back again, put his face close down to the king's and whispered, "I am an archangel." The king started violently and said to himself, "Would God I were with the outlaws again, for lo, now I am the prisoner of a madman." His apprehensions were heightened, and they showed plainly in his face. In a low, excited voice, the hermit continued, "I see you feel my atmosphere. There's awe in your face. None may be in this atmosphere and not be thus affected, for it is the very atmosphere of heaven. I go thither and return in the twinkling of an eye. I was made an archangel on this very spot. It is 5 years ago, by angels sent from heaven to confer that awful dignity. Their presence filled this place with an intolerable brightness, and they knelt to me, king, yea, they knelt to me, for I was greater than they. I have walked in the courts of heaven and held speech with the patriarchs. Touch my hand. Be not afraid. Touch it. There. Now thou hast touched a hand which has been clasped by Jacob and Abraham and Isaac, for I have walked in the golden courts. I have seen the deity face to face." He paused to give his speech effect. Then his face suddenly changed, and he started to his feet again, saying with angry energy, "Yes, I am an archangel, a mere archangel. I that might have been pope. It is verily true. I was told it from heaven in a dream 20 years ago. Ah, yes, I was to be pope, and I should have been pope, for heaven had said it. But the king dissolved my religious house, and I, poor, obscure, unfriended monk, was cast homeless upon the world, robbed of my mighty destiny." Here he began to mumble again, and beat his forehead in futile rage with his fist, now and then articulating a venomous curse, and now and then a pathetic, "Wherefore I am not but an archangel, I that should have been pope." So he went on for an hour, while the poor little king sat and suffered. Then all at once the old man's frenzy departed, and he became all gentleness. His voice softened. He came down out of his clouds and fell to prattling along so simply and humanely that he soon won the king's heart completely. The old devotee moved the boy nearer to the fire and made him comfortable, doctored his small bruises and abrasions with a deft and tender hand. Then he set about preparing and cooking a supper, chatting pleasantly all the time, and occasionally stroking the lad's cheek or patting his head in such a gently caressing way that in a little while all the fear and repulsion inspired by the archangel were changed to reverence and affection for the man. This happy state of things continued while the two ate the supper. Then, after a prayer before the shrine, the hermit put the boy to bed in a small adjoining room. tucking him in as snugly and as lovingly as a mother might, and so, with a parting caress, left him and laid down and sat down by the fire, and began to poke the brands about in an absent and aimless way. Presently, the hermit paused, then tapped his forehead several times with his fingers, as if trying to recall some thought which had escaped from his mind. Now he started quickly up and entered his guest's room and said, "Thou art king?" "Yes," was the response, drowsily uttered. "What king?" "Of England, of course." "Of England. Then Henry is gone?" "Alack, it is so. I am his son." A black frown settled upon the hermit's face, and he clenched his bony hands with a vindictive energy. He stood a few moments, breathing fast and swallowing repeatedly. Then he said in a husky voice, "Dost know it was he that turned us out into the world, houseless and homeless?" There was no response. The old man bent down and scanned the boy's reposeful face and listened to his placid breathing. "He sleeps soundly." And the frown vanished away from the hermit's face and gave place to an expression of evil satisfaction. A smile flitted across the dreaming boy's features. The hermit muttered, "So his heart is happy," and he turned away. He went stealthily about the place, seeking here and there for something, now and then halting to listen, now and then jerking his head around and casting a quick glance toward the bed, and always muttering, always grumbling to himself. At last he found what he seemed to want, a rusty old butcher knife and a whetstone. Then he crept to his place by the fire, sat himself down, and began to whet the knife softly on the stone, still muttering, mumbling, exclaiming. The wind sighed around the lonely place. The mysterious voices of the night floated out by the distances. The shining eyes of venturesome mice and rats peered out at the old man from cracks and coverts, but he went on with his work, rapt and absorbed. At long intervals he drew his thumb along the edge of the knife and nodded his head with satisfaction. "It grows sharper," he said. "Yes, it grows sharper." He took no note of the flight of time, but worked tranquilly on, entertaining himself with his thoughts, which broke out occasionally in articulate speech. "It was his father that did it all. I am but an archangel, but for him I would be Pope." The little king stirred. The hermit sprang noiselessly to the bedside and went down upon his knees, bending over the prostrate form with his knife uplifted. The boy stirred again. His eyes came open for an instant, but they saw nothing. The next moment his tranquil breathing showed that his sleep was sound once more. The hermit watched and listened for a time, keeping his position and scarcely breathing. Then he slowly lowered his arm and presently crept away, saying, "It is long past midnight. It is not best that he should cry out, lest by accident someone be passing." He glided about the hovel, gathering a rag here, a thong there, and another one yonder. Then he returned, and by careful and gentle handling, he managed to tie the king's ankles together without waking him. Next he essayed to tie the wrists. He made several attempts to cross them, but the boy always drew one hand or the other away, just as the cord was ready to be applied. But at last, when the archangel was almost ready to despair, the boy crossed his hands himself, and the next moment they were bound. Now a bandage was passed under the sleeper's chin and brought up over his head and tied fast, and so softly, so gradually, and so deftly were the knots drawn together and compacted that the boy slept peacefully through it all without stirring.